Okay, so we're going to look at narration and point of view. In your books, that is pages 174 to 177 is what I'd like you to read. So as you can see, 174. But we're going to start on 175 together in this video, although I'd like you to read all those pages on your own. So the first thing we need to know when it comes to point of view and narration. So your narration is the person who's telling the story, basically. The narration is the telling of the story. And you can have many different kinds of narrators in a story, right? The first thing you need to know is that there are three different persons. That means basically I, you, and she, he, they, right? So I is first person. That's when I am telling a story from my perspective specifically. Examples of first person that we've already seen is the harvest. The narrator, the character in the harvest, the speaker is speaking from the first person, the I point of view. So I is first person. You is second person. That's a little bit more unusual, but you are going to see an example of that with Lori Moore's How to Man, I'm blanking on the title. How to Speak to Your Mother, How to Talk to Your Mother, notes. Anyway, you'll see in the syllabus. It's also already uploaded. Lori Moore in that uses the second person, which is really pretty unusual for, well, it's not pretty unusual, but it's not the most common for stories, right? So that's the second person. It's when you're speaking to the you. Sometimes the you the writer is speaking to is not necessarily the writer, but the person. It's like if I were talking to myself and saying, you need to get your act together, or you need to get up earlier and go to bed earlier, that's second person self talk, right? Sometimes in stories, that's why the you is used. All right, so far we got first person, which is the I, second person, which is the you, and third person, which is, I think of it as being external to the more intimate I or you. The third person is he, she, they. It's when something is being described and the narrator is not necessarily involved in the story, although they can be, right? So those are the three types of person that the narration is delivered from. Let's take a look first at third person. Third person narration is probably mostly what you see traditionally in stories and in fiction and throughout literature. And there's many different kinds of the third person narrator. So let's just look at this little paragraph. A third person narrator tells an unidentified listener or reader what happened, referring to all the characters using the pronouns he, she, they. Third person narration is virtually always external, meaning the narration is not a character, the narrator is not a character in the story and does not participate in its action. Okay, so now you have lots of different kinds of third person narration or third person narrators. So the omniscient, which means all knowing, omniscient, and or another word for that is unlimited narrator. They as a narrator, right, have access to the thoughts, experiences, ideas. They have access to the internal world of all the characters they're narrating about. So it's not a person that can actually exist in the world unless, I don't know, some spiritual all knowing being was that narrator, right? A limited narrator is an external third person narrator who tells from one specific kind of more fixed point of view. I think a limited third person narrator an example of that might be um, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, because although it is certainly told in the third person, Walter Mitty is not speaking to us in the first person. We have access to his internal thoughts, right? Like we would with the unlimited narrator, but we're only seeing through his eyes. So I'm wondering if we could consider that a limited narrator. Like we don't get to see through from his wife's perspective. We don't get access to her thoughts specifically. Okay, so the focal character, so again with Walter Mitty, would be called, he is the central consciousness in that story. He's the only person we have access to with regard to internal thoughts. All right, and then the last one is an objective narrator. So the objective narrator is like basically stating the facts of the story and not necessarily reporting on how a person is feeling. We don't get these descriptive pieces that describe the internal world of the characters. Instead, we might get dialogue with really objective narration and description of what's happening in the surroundings. All right, first person, we talked about that. We've already talked about this idea of the unreliable narrator. You get that when you often have a first person narration. So, again, Amy Hempel's The Harvest is a really good example of that because our speaker, our narrator, tells us she's lying throughout that story, or at least exaggerating. All right, second person narration. Like narrators who refer to themselves as we throughout a work of fiction, second person narrators who consistently speak to the you are unusual. So, yeah, you're going to see that less, but you will see it in Laurie Moore's piece for this week. I don't think there's more you need to know about that. Let's take a minute to talk about tense. Along with the grammatical person, the verb tense used has an effect on the narration of the story. So if you're speaking only in the present tense, if the writer is speaking only in the present tense, there's something about that that draws the reader into the immediacy of what's happening. Whereas if you're speaking in the past tense, you know it's already over, right? And so the tense of our verbs helps us feel closer or farther from the action of the story. And I don't mean closer or farther as good or bad. It's just sort of what is true, right? Narrator versus implied author. So this is interesting. One thing that you need to remember is that, so Amy Hempel wrote The Harvest. The speaker in The Harvest is an unnamed young female protagonist, right? Because she is female and because she maybe lives where Amy Hempel lives does not mean Amy Hempel is telling us her story, right? So it's important that we don't get the narrator or our protagonist or our characters necessarily mixed up with our authors. They're not necessarily the same thing. All right, I feel like that's all I want to talk to you about with regard to narration and point of view. Point of view becomes really important when you're trying to get into a story, right? If you're not relating to the character from or the speaker, the narration from the from if you're not relating to the point of view the story is being told from, it's going to be harder to get into it. But if you can identify that point of view and just kind of figure it out, that might give you more entrance into a story. All right, now we're going to go on to character, which is page 218 to 224. So I think it's the next chapter. Where are we? Pages. Well, I went way too far. All right, here we go. Okay, there's a lot of important stuff in here, and some of it might be stuff you need to unlearn because there's been over the years many different ways of talking about characters that we don't really use anymore. All right, so for the character, it is page 218 to 224. We are going to start on heroes and villains versus protagonists and antagonists. This distinction is really important because in the past, I think people used to teach the protagonist as like the conquering hero, right? And the antagonist as the villain. But it doesn't need to be that way, and often it is far more complex than that in a story, particularly because the reason we read literature is to get insight into other people's thinking and other experiences. Every kind of experience and encounter with literature should challenge our own moral assumptions and our own ethics. So if every single thing you read had a very clear good and a very clear evil, you wouldn't really challenge yourself or grow, right? So it's important that we move away from this idea of heroes and villains. Instead, what we have, and the words we use now, is protagonist and antagonist. And the antagonist may be the villain, right? But often the antagonist is just another person that for some reason is part of the conflict or the obstacle to the protagonist. Many, many, many times, as is true in real life, even with ourselves, the protagonist is very flawed and maybe someone else's antagonist, right? On a personal note, it's always important to remember that although you are the protagonist of your own story, you're probably the antagonist in someone else's story. Read this part about major versus minor characters. It's not hugely important, but we're not going to go over it, but it's exactly what it sounds like. However, it's important to note that minor characters are necessary to really fill out a story, especially when we talk about plot structure and story arc. Flat versus round and static versus dynamic characters, that's just what it sounds like. Flat and round, a better way to say it is static versus dynamic, because static means still, unchanging, sort of almost like a stereotype or a trope, whereas dynamic means robust, changing. We want both our protagonists and antagonists to be dynamic characters, because that's generally where the resolution comes from, is those dynamic characters pushing themselves, changing, and growing. Stock characters and archetypes. So flat characters who represent a familiar, frequently reoccurring type, the dumb blonde, the mad scientist, the inept sidekick, the plain yet ever sympathetic best friend, are called stock characters because they seem to be pulled out of a stock room of familiar, prefabricated characters. In case anyone doesn't know what that means, it's like a stock image on the internet. It's just something that is sort of up for grabs and we all recognize as a thing because we've seen it so many times, and it is built around stereotypes, right? Characters that reoccur in the myths and literature of many different ages and cultures are instead called archetypes. So these are different things. An archetype is not a stock character, and an archetype, although it does have sort of a pattern that it follows, and often it connects to many other characters of the same archetype throughout literature, it is more dynamic than a stock character. A stock character would be a flat character. An archetype is often still very dynamic. So reading character in fiction and life. Read that on your own. Think, this is where I want to leave you. Think about as you read what reveals the character to you. Is it dialogue, and whether or not they're dynamic or whether or not they're static? Again, static meaning unmoving, still, kind of fixed. Dynamic meaning changing over time, which is what your protagonist will do in a story that follows traditional story arc. There's generally a lesson in a story, right? So yeah, think about how you get to know the character. Is it through purely description, right? In an omniscient third person narration, you often will get to first know your character through description, their physical description. Then setting comes into that as well, right? Like where they're from, where the context they exist within, what they look like, right? You'll start to get to know your character. But then, depending on the kind of narration, once you get into that character's thoughts, you'll get to know them more. Or sometimes you're not given a picture into their thoughts, and instead you have to infer that from their actions and from the dialogue they have with other characters. So do go ahead and read both of these and think about them as you read the stories for this week. Thank you.